Welcome to our first episode of Targeted Talk Leaders in Oncology. So I'm Jamie, one of the directors of Apsida. Essentially, I've spent 10 years in clinical development recruitment, so mainly recruiting people into clinical development roles across pharma and biotech, all in oncology, a little bit in hematology, but all within that kind of niche space. So got the lovely Michael Grant with us here today, who's going to share his wisdom, undoubtedly. Mike, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, a little overview before I dive into a load of questions. But actually, the first place I'm going to start before your intro to you is, most importantly, how's Luna? My second favourite dog.
Well, she's sleeping quietly for now behind me. Although we have got renovations upstairs, so if you hear any barking, it's not me.
For the listeners, I went out with Mick to a restaurant in London Bridge, and he brought Luna with him, and she was a magnet. Everyone was interested in saying hello, so she's pretty cool.
Who needs a personality when you've got a dog?
Fortunately, you've got plenty of personality, so you don't need the magnet. Anyway, over to you then.
So I went off to medical school, grew up in Ireland. Went to medical school in Belfast. Very quickly found myself on what could be considered the nerdier, geekier end of the spectrum within the cohort. And then pretty much every year in medical school did kind of these funded studentships in laboratory bench work. Went off after kind of doing a few of those, kind of realizing I was interested in oncology, or at least the sciences behind it, and then went off to do an intercalated degree at the University of Leeds. So at the time, they had a very long research project for intercalated degrees. It was a full 12 months of lab work in molecular sciences, open brackets oncology. So it was very skewed towards oncology, and this is around the time of Ipi/Nivo being licensed in melanoma. So these really transformative stories about immuno-oncology coming into the space. Really captivated by that. And then returned, finished my medical school in Belfast, and then applied for the academic foundation program, as it was then. Now I believe it's called the specialized foundation program. But applied to London. It was very, very competitive. Had very low hopes, but then was very grateful to get my first choice theme within that, which was medical oncology at Bart's Hospital in central London, under the titan that was and is Professor Thomas Coles. And then from literally year one of postgraduate work as a resident doctor, was a sub-investigator on 30, 40 commercial and academic studies with Tom. And then in the second year had a lot more protected time to work specifically for him. So thankfully, there's always those stories of all these medical students who gear their entire CVs towards, surgery or dermatology, and then they actually do the clinical work and absolutely hate the specialty. But I really took to it like a duck to water. So really, really enjoyed it. And then very much in the mindset of the academic clinician roadmap, which was kind of set up by I think called the Walport Report back in the early 2000s. I did the academic foundation program, so do the academic clinical fellowship, and then PhD, and then academic clinical lectureship, and then move on. So very, very prescribed roadmap that I was very much sipping the Kool-Aid, fully signed up to the cult of academic medicine. And then was with Tom, was doing a couple of additional years of clinical research fellowships, again for Professor Poole, mostly in immuno-onc. So doing what effectively was clinical development to a degree within the academic studies. And then also basically the entire day job was phase 1 to phase 3 medical oncology commercial studies as well that were coming through the department. So was really well versed in it. We had a really great research team as part of Bart's Cancer Institute. We were also part of the Cancer Research UK City of London network. So within that, UCL, the Royal Free, Francis Crick Institute, And then as part of my job, I would cover some of the robotic surgeries, robotic nephrectomy clinics from a medical oncology perspective with Tom at the Royal Free. So I got to see a really in-depth and full-on experience of full kind of bench side to bedside clinical development from an academic point of view. Helped contribute to some of the NICE, or the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, submission packages for some of the commercial entities as well. So really, really broad experience for someone who was at this point was only had been a resident doctor for 4 years. So amazing experience. Very much sink or swim at times. NHS, albeit things have probably, if anything, slipped since, but even at the time, obviously it wasn't very well resourced. So you're doing everything from designing the CRFs to entering data yourself alongside seeing the patients and everything. So a really, really holistic perspective alongside working with the regulatory bodies and kind of the aligned professions. So kind of clinops and business development and everything else. So as far as academic jobs go, was a really good jumping off point. However, I never envisioned leaving the NHS. So I was applying for PhDs at the time in the Crick in Bart's Cancer Institute, and then was approached by a headhunter for a spin out from UCL and Crick, which was and is Achilles Therapeutics, which we'd actually kind of been discussing in a journal club maybe like 4 or 5 weeks before, because Charlie Swanton was one of the co-founders, who was obviously a big force and remains a big force within Cancer Research UK and medical oncology within the UK and internationally. So got approached, didn't really know what this meant, didn't know what industry was going to be like. So I kind of went to Tom and I was like, well, this has come across the desk. What do you think? And I was expecting him to be like, stick to the path.
Don't leave me. How dare you?
Yeah. So don't leave me short. We're not getting locums. But no, I spoke to Tom. Tom was really supportive, and he was like, well, you're basically already doing clinical development for me. I was very hesitant in regards to what leaving, at least part-time, what leaving the NHS looked like and what impact it would have on careers and all the various other internalized manifestations of Catholic guilt coming to the fore. And Tom was very good, and he was like, do this for 6 months. Well, if you get the job, do it for 6 months. You can still do a clinic or 2 a week for me. And if you absolutely hate it, then you just put it in your CV. It's a nice piece of industry drug development for a biotech, and it'll still serve you well. And if you apply directly to medical oncology higher training or whatever else. So then, went off to Achilles Therapeutics, got the job. Dr. Jane Robertson, who's an absolute legend within AstraZeneca and various other biotechs, and now actually is going back to do the Lord's work at the Christie full time. So she was a really venerable person to be hired under, because she was a real kind of clinical academic who then went into industry as opportunities arose. So it was a nice to have that kind of influence going in to ease me gently into the world of industry. But yeah, I had a great time. 6 months became multiple years. Continued to do oncology clinics, and still do on the side. Very, very flexible. Also entered with the Royal College of Physicians higher training in pharmaceutical medicine, which is the branch of medicine specializing in clinical trials, alongside ticking the boxes and competencies for medical oncology, albeit 1 or 2 clinics a week. That would take a very long time, but yeah. So I've bounced around a couple biotechs since, all kind of in immune onc space, which is what I've very much been interested in. And certainly, if once you've got an interest, once you've got experience in something, it kind of snowballs. But certainly, you've a little more autonomy or efficacy than you might have in an NHS training program, where you're kind of rotated through various departments without, or particular specialties, without too much warrant in exactly what you do. So that's been a very pleasant surprise. But now, I'm almost 5 years in biotechs. So basically all of them have been academic Cancer Research UK spin out. So I mean, I basically should get a sponsorship deal with CRUK, but I've had a great experience, been able to maintain academic roles, academic outputs alongside do my master's at Oxford in experimental medicine with the Department of Oncology there, whilst still maintaining clinical practice, whilst still doing a bit of teaching and doing the industry job as well. So you'd be surprised once you come off a pretty heavy NHS rota of nights and weekends what you can achieve in your spare time when you're not asleep.
Thanks for the overview. Really, really helpful. Got a lot of questions that I'd like to dive into, but I've refrained myself from asking. You've obviously had a successful career both academically, but now also in industry as well. If I was to take you all the way back to the start of your career, even before kind of the NHS, was it always your goal to go into cancer drug development? Because I meet a lot of students, and at the time they don't really know what they want to do. They just want to kind of do something or be successful. So if I was to kind of take you all the way back to your kind of mind back then, was that what your goal was, or you just were just going with the flow?
So I think that, I mean, I would say, and I always say to students, when you're in medical school, just throw yourself into whatever rotation or firm that you're in. So I remember so desperately wanting to like ophthalmology. I really wanted to like ophthalmology. It was just like, I was really
so random.
It was a great job. There's a relatively good lifestyle. It's a mix of surgery and medicine. So I really wanted to like that. I just didn't like it. And then through the summer studentships and basic science that I was doing, those were a mix of oncology and microbiology. But the kind of uniting theme between those was immunology and how that interacts with specific pathologies. So that kind of planted the seed of oncology. And then when I went through my integrated bachelor's degree, I chose that because that was a really long project. So usually at medical school, the bench projects for a bachelor's are like 6 to 8 weeks. So this is a full 12-month kind of alongside taught modules, but in immersion into medical oncology, preclinical research. So that kind of helped solidify it. Towards the end of that, I had perhaps a misguided idea of looking at doing MD PhD, so integrating a PhD into your medical school experience as well. Thankfully, I spoke to some of the registrars who were in the lab with me in Leeds and some of the ones in Belfast as well, and they were like, "Are you sure you want to do oncology for the rest of your life?" And I was like, "Oh, I think so." Yeah. And they're like, in the project you're doing for PhD, you're so specific. You're making yourself a sub specialist before you've even graduated, before you've had any clinical experience. So I took that advice on board and finished my clinical training at Belfast at the time. So Professor Patrick Johnson, who's very sadly passed away there about 4 or 5 years ago, was the dean of the medical school. He was a medical oncologist. So at Queen's Belfast, we actually had a decent amount of oncology clinical attachment within medical school, which is not a GMC requirement. So, for example, past 4 or 5 years now, I've been an honorary clinical lecturer at Barts, and certainly their standard medical curriculum doesn't have any in-depth experience within medical oncology beyond oncology emergencies, which would be required obviously for other settings as well. But yeah, I got enough exposure as an undergrad. So then when I began to apply for the academic foundation program, which was then themed to a given specialty, I already had an idea that I like the basic science of it. I really like translational medicine. So, that interface between preclinical basic science and clinical medicine. And I knew that I liked the immuno treatments that were emerging, the kind of growing understanding of the interplay between the immune system and cancer. So I think I was in a relatively good position at the end of medical school to have a sense of what I wanted to do. And then having the exposure to not only medical oncology, but oncology clinical trials at a very early stage, I solidified that very, very quickly. So that enabled me to become a bit more laser focused on that as a career path. Whereas I think the vast majority of medical students I speak to are really, even if they've done your previous degrees or they've done research in a given field, I'm always very, very encouraging to try as many specialties as they can, and then not to commit until they've actually done it clinically. Because the clinical job can be very, very different to the science. So
no, it's interesting. So essentially, you've kind of, become a doctor, and then kind of slowly specialized into the field of oncology. And when you were kind of finding your feet, you then decided, this is what I wanted to do, and you've gone, full speed ahead to try and make that happen.
Yeah, no, I was very, very fortunate. So the academic foundation program, having that protected time, having it be in the specialty I was interested in, and having clinical trials within that specialty is very, very, very rare for someone at that career stage. So I was huge, I owe, absolutely everything to Tom Poles. That was a real kind of masterclass and what that looks like, and specifically what clinical development and clinical trials would look like within that space. Because even you could do a medical oncology ward job, and it would look very, very different to the academic clinical role within that. And again, and the current system within the UK is kind of in the news recently in regard to how your first jobs were assigned after medical school is very controversial, and I don't know all the details, so I won't go into it. But there is a degree of a random number generator. So even if you're very interested in something, you may not get that specialty in your first 2 years of training. So so for current undergrads and recently qualified resident doctors, I still think it is very, very important to throw yourself into any specialty that comes your way. And if there is something that you're really passionate about, you can find ways of shoehorning that into what you're doing. So I had upper GI surgery job when I was in my first graduate year, and I was able to do a ton of projects in upper GI cancers for that, for example. So there's always a way of kind of exploring your interest within that. But don't commit too early. You never know. Something like, there's lots of people who go leave medical school, want to be surgeons, and then do a psychiatry job and find out that's their passion. So I think be very, very open to it, I think is the best advice. But if you are interested in clinical development, clinical trials, try to gain exposure to that, which isn't always easy.
I was going to say that's
early stage. It's something you're probably going to seek out. In the job I'm in at the minute, we're very heavily aligned with or associated with the University of Oxford. So we've got an internship program there. So I've been able to help some medical students kind of explore that capacity. The Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine with Royal College of Physicians a couple of years ago had their first kind of medical elective in pharmaceutical medicine. So I think the awareness of clinical trials as a dedicated specialty is becoming more prolific in the minds of undergraduates. But hitherto, it was you would do a lot of specialty training before you do a clinical trial on anything, be that medical oncology, rheumatology, whatever. So getting that early exposure, I think, is really, really important. And there are ways of doing it, but it does require often, not taking no for an answer, sending a lot of emails, and sticking your foot in various doors until something happens.
So would you say that you're quite a persistent, curious person to be able to knock down those doors and essentially get what you wanted?
I think persistent is probably a very nice way of phrasing it. In hindsight, I would probably describe myself as quite annoying. But yeah, no, I was very much so, because I'd done the laboratory bench work, even as an undergraduate, something you could do, you could contribute with eminent professors or trialists. They'll tend to have more invitations to write journal pieces, or they'll have more data than they have staff to do something with it. So there's always an opportunity there's usually an opportunity to volunteer in some way, shape, or form. If you're able to demonstrate genuine interest in something, I think you'd be hard pressed. I think medics as a species tend to be relatively encouraging to those who are interested in the specialty they've dedicated their life to. So even if it's just for need of a good audience, there's often opportunities to get access that way.
You have to be quite persistent, and you have to kind of put yourself out there if you're going to progress, essentially.
Yeah. I think especially for clinical trials, because that's something that usually doesn't come into your remit until you're kind of mid, even to late stage. I mean, there's some consultants who will only begin to do trials after they fully CCT. So I think trials in particular are something you want to volunteer as best you can, as early as you can.
Okay.
And certainly there are facets of running a clinical trial that are amenable to students. So when I was at Bart's, I set up a program, student selected module that I led for final year medical students to come see and do some clinical trial work. And out of that, we ended up getting a few medical students to stay on in kind of paid, band 4 roles to do data entry and help with paperwork of studies and so on. And then via that, albeit not the most glamorous of work, you begin to learn the vernacular of what a trial is, the structure of it, who does what, when X, Y, and Z happen, and so on. So not something that's going to fall in your lap. Pharmaceutical medicine is still a relatively small specialty within the UK. If it's something that you're interested in as an undergraduate or as an early years resident doctor, it's something you're going to have to seek out to scratch the itch and see if you like it.
Good advice. So you've obviously then moved into industry, and you said you were kind of a bit skeptical, to say the least, when you got approached by Headhunter. I must admit, it's quite rare that, from my experiences, that biotech or small companies take a doctor out of academics, despite your experience with clinical development in academic trials, and then into I think they were commercial stage, or certainly get in that way, at that time. So, in terms of that transition, how did you find that?
It's great. You could pee whenever you wanted. So that was a real step. That was a real step in the right direction for the NHS. I mean, I guess you're from the start of medical school, you're kind of surrounded by doctors, nurses, allied healthcare professionals in clinical settings, plus or minus, some laboratory based or scientific settings, but never really do you have exposure to people working, commercially in industry or with commercial backgrounds. So I had rip roaring imposter syndrome probably for the first, year I was in industry. But then I think one of the biggest hurdles I think for medics to overcome is the perhaps lack of awareness of your skills and ability. So I mean, even the undergraduate medical curriculum, you learn a vast quantity of information, the kind of soft transferable skills of dealing with pressure, interpersonal skills, dealing with patients and high pressure situations and so on, makes for a very good employee, probably in many different spheres. So it's kind of, but the the NHS, at least, and I'm sure it's same for other healthcare systems, is very hierarchical. So I think there's a degree of hesitancy of putting one's head above the parapet. And in industry, you do have to kind of push through that, as there will be instances where perhaps very confident and well-meaning individuals who are not, physicians or scientists may have strong opinions on one thing or another in regards to a clinical study, which don't hold up the don't hold up to the clinical realities of translational medicine. So certainly overcome the imposter syndrome was a big step.
I mean, I can relate to imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I mean, it's just something that comes with experience. And obviously, I was recruited into industry from a physician's point of view at a very early stage. So I hadn't even, I hadn't really even got over the imposter syndrome of being a resident doctor, let alone, having to, do bits of line management and, guiding clinical sites and what to do when X, Y, and Z happens, and talking to the MHRA and the EMA and the FDA. But something that comes with experience, and that's something I think it's something to be aware of, though. I think medics know a lot more than they think.
Yeah.
I have a lot more to bring to the table than they perhaps have been rewarded for in the past.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if anyone was looking to enter industry, I would bear that in mind, that if you're going to be bashful in any way, there's a very high probability of being steamrolled by more bullshy people who have grown up in the hard and fast leagues of industry.
Yeah, it's definitely a different experience altogether. What was it like going into a small company? Well, I'd imagine you were probably one of the only positions there. I mean, apart from Jane at the time, I suppose. So
Yeah.
how was that?
It was just me and Jane, team of two.
The super team.
Super team, yeah. So I mean, for me, it was so again, I was very lucky in being tangentially prepared by the academic clinical role I was doing, because we were such a trial heavy department, because we had so many academic studies under Tom. A lot of, so even like, stats analysis, I was doing bits of that. Protocol development, I was doing bits of that. CRS development, patient information sheet, all these components I was already doing.
Yeah.
And then because the technology I was working with in that first job was so experimental, so it was a cell therapy, obviously it falls under advanced therapeutic classification. It was a first in human, so there was a lot of basic science to inhale, and then thankfully I had some lab experience to fall back on. So, I'm not a basic scientist. I'm sure I'd like to consider myself a physician scientist, whatever that means these days. But I knew enough of the vernacular to speak to the lab scientists and kind of begin to draw together the various threads that were required to translate that into a clinical program. I mean, Jane was fantastic. Jane had tons of experience. So having Jane there was great. Then Jane, well, for me, very sadly, announced that she was moving on. And then there was a period where I was the only full-time medic, while I was waiting for Professor Carl Peggs, who was one of the other co-founders, to come on board. So I had Carl and Jane I could kind of contact and WhatsApp as required. But it was certainly a very much sink or swim situation. So it was it was critical that I had already had those kinds of experiences in clinical trials within academia, because that, and obviously there was clinical operations teams and there was the regulatory teams, so nothing was going to fall apart. But it was certainly a lot of responsibility from a very early point, because ultimately there was no one else there, or if they were there, they had other priorities to deal with day-to-day problems as they emerged in a first in human study. So having at least some hands-on clinical trial experience definitely was a prerequisite, I think, for small biotech. I've not worked in big pharma, but having talked to mentors in big pharma and colleagues who've worked in big pharma, the role is a bit more prescriptive. And there are, well, in one of the jobs I worked in was kind of a biopharma, so it's kind of mid-size. And within that, I had, clinical scientists to delegate bits and pieces to, and my job became more focused on final signatory elements and consulting on questions rather than the hands-on day-to-day. Whereas in a smaller biotech, it's you're writing basically the whole protocol. I've been working on the translational package with some of the pre-clinical scientists. I've been doing some of the stats packages with stat support from the University of Oxford. So you have to be a jack of all trades in a very small biotech when you're kind of not in a position where you can contract everything out. You're in a position where everything's so mission critical. You do kind of have to look at even what appear to be relatively routine tasks with a microscopic lens to ensure that these small problems don't scale up over time. So for biotech, yes, definitely having previous experience in clinical trials would be of extreme value. However, if someone was interested in going into a larger firm, you can start as a medical science liaison, theoretically with no trial experience, and kind of, cut out your merit that way and build up experience, and then move into the clinical scientist role, or an associate medical director role that way. So definitely not an absolute prerequisite, but I think for a biotech, I imagine the gray hairs I developed through first in human studies would have been a lot more, quite a few more of them if I hadn't already had some experience in clinical trials.
I say it's definitely quite rare, because a lot of the mandates that I get when I'm working with biotechs is to have someone who's been there and had that kind of small biotech experience. So it's a bit of a catch-22, because if you don't have that experience already, how are you meant to get it?
It's an entry-level role, and we want 10 years of experience.
That's where I have to try and educate, what the market looks like and what is feasible, what's not, and use data, research, market mapping to advise accordingly. But from my experiences, it's definitely have to be a resilient and a different type of person to metaphorically roll your sleeves up and get your hands dirty in all the different things, especially what you're doing at the moment with Infinitopes. Like you say, you're a specialist in what you do, but you have to be a jack of all trades to be able to be successful in a small biotech. So
yeah,
no, I definitely resonate with that. You talked about mentors. You mentioned about Jane and so on and so forth. Who would you say has been the biggest mentor to you in your career, and why?
So I mean, ultimately, probably Tom Poles. Ironically, not as a pharmaceutical physician himself, but as damn near close as you can be. I think even a couple of weeks ago, I ran into Tom at a conference, and exposed all these professional and life questions I had for him. So Tom's Tom's a very level-headed guy, and is very, for people in his team, is fantastic enabler. And very much let you rise to the level of your own incompetence, wherever that level may lie. So ultimately, Tom, I think would be, and I was just so lucky being able to have that experience and have him as a clinical supervisor so early in training. But then outside of that, Jane's been a fantastic resource, and again, I've kind of fallen in the pattern of seeking out mentorship from people who have kind of had careers similar to mine, or similar to what I would like mine to look like, in terms of these kind of portfolio careers of working in industry, maximizing the impact you can have for patients by translating cutting edge research and bench work into clinical treatments, while also maintaining some degree of teaching, maintaining some kind of degree of clinical practice. So those have been the people that kind of naturally drifted towards Matilde Sagase at Achilles, who's a VP medical director there, and is one of my educational supervisors for the Oncology positions. Is another inspiration. She's very Italian, we'll put it that way. She's also been very, very encouraging. Actually, and again, is another person who was clinical academic, and then kind of find themselves in industry rather than seeking it out, which is something that very much aligns with my experience and my kind of overall trajectory.
How important is a mentor? If we've got junior doctors, entry-level guys that are listening to this show, and hopefully they are, how important is having a mentor? Because it sounds like you bumped into Tom, asking him some questions. I'm sure if you bumped into Jane and Carl Peggs, etc., I'm sure you've got questions for them as well. So how important is a mentor?
I think very important, because I think pharmaceutical medicine, so as a specialty within the Royal College of Physicians, is so niche that there isn't vast quantities of information out there. You're unlikely to bumped into anyone on the ward effectively, and a lot of the information is just very esoteric and difficult to access. And with that comes, I guess, a hesitancy to even explore it. So I mean, when for example, when that headhunter first approached me, I was like, come do this job. I didn't really know what clinical development meant. And then it was when we went home, was like, that's what you're doing now. And I was like, oh, great. I'll do that then. But even then, I was very reticent to give up clinical practice. And I've been able to continue ticking boxes for medical oncology, but none of these things are advertised to you. You know, these are things you really have to seek out, send lots of emails about. And ultimately, if Tom had said, you know, well, I don't know about that, I would never have done it. You know, if it was Tom's encouragement, he's go, just do it and you see what you, if you like it, keep going. If you don't, come back, you know. So that was very useful. Another person, Urmi Sukla, who has been very supportive actually in my career, and because of COVID, we've physically never met. But she had done with the Royal College of Physicians, they were doing this series of interviews, which was like specialty spotlight. And then I think around the same time that I was hemming and hawing about making the move, her video had come up, and it kind of talked about her move. I think she'd previously done obs and gynae training, and then moved into pharmaceutical medicine. So and basically I just, you know, found her on LinkedIn. I was like, hey, I don't really know anything about this specialty. This opportunity's come up, you know, can I have a call with you? Can you advise me on X, Y, and Z? And she was extremely supportive. And I think because pharmaceutical medicine is still quite a niche specialty, people are quite keen when people approach you to learn more. Because I think ultimately there's still, I mean, I'd say like, you know, 80%. I went home to a wedding recently in Ireland. It was all doctors. And they're like, what is it that you do? And I was like, oh gosh. So I think there's, you know, there's a very minimal awareness of what it is, because I think, you know, it's not cardiology, it's not resp, it's not surgery, you know, so people just haven't had experience of it, so they don't know what the day-to-day job is like. So it's really, really useful just to reach out to me. Usually lots of people have reached out to me on LinkedIn. I've gone for lots of coffees to try and, you know, answer these really basic questions of like, you know, you go in Monday at 9 a.m. What do? You know, are you opening a laptop? Are you in a lab? You know what happens? So
you're making a coffee. That's what you're doing. 100%.
Oh yeah. I'm racking up a free coffees. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I haven't paid for a coffee in years. I think reaching out to someone's very, because it is still a very niche specialty. Hopefully that is changing. Numbers are increasing, and I think especially post Brexit, obviously the MHRA is gearing itself up to be a bigger entity in terms of you know, especially early phase clinical studies, and to achieve that there just need to be more pharmaceutical medicine within the country, and the faculty of pharmaceutical medicine certainly are pushing that. I also had another just really chance encounter. I was the president of this UK Medical Student Association when I was a student, and then into my early years as a doctor. And then we got invited to the Lancet. We're having like a launch of their new annual theme or something. And I just happened to be sat beside Professor Stonier, who is one of the old presidents of the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine. He was like, oh, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, well, I'm doing medical oncology, but like, I really want to do this trial things come up." And he was like, "Have you heard about pharmaceutical medicine?" And I was like, "Oh gosh, I should have read up on this before I came here." So yeah, there's lots and lots of chance encounters that kind of removed several layers of hesitancy that I would have had. And without those mentors being in place, I don't think I would have made the jump, to be honest. I would have continued on that path, and then probably ended up where I am now, just later on.
Yeah. Well, shout out to all the mentors out there that have helped you and everyone else, because I mean, just that question that you progressed up the career trajectory pretty quickly, and I'm sure those mentors have had a big say in that.
Well, you know, we all try.
Apart from your amazing skills, obviously. Apart from your amazing skills.
No. It's all style, no substance in me.
Well, another thing I picked up on, you spoke about imposter syndrome. It's something that comes up a lot, and I've felt that so much over the last kind of 5 years or so since setting up Apsida. You know, I don't have a medical doctor degree. I'm not a scientist. Didn't even go to university, for those that
didn't. For me, Jamie, for me.
So, and then obviously setting up a company which is now 30 people, big kind of people look to you for the answers, and sometimes you're scratching your head and like, oh, I don't have the answers to that, and you know, you try to give advice. So, imposter syndrome is across all businesses.
How do you kind of get over that from a medical perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue imposter syndrome to a degree is healthy. If you come into a completely new environment, with no experience of what you're doing, and are very confident, there's something very wrong with you. I have observed in others in industry, not actually physicians, but I think the NHS and medical training in general really batters the ego out of you at a very early stage, which I think is good. And I think that ego battering is a kind of critical patient safety element of your training. So it's like always being aware of the things you don't know, and then also being aware there's things you probably don't even know you don't know. So I think that's what is good about physicians in general. I think there is a safety net of imposter syndrome installed in you, which I do think is good, because ultimately it comes down to patient safety. And I think if you're unsure about something, then you need to be escalating, you need to be talking to colleagues. And then ultimately, you speak to these professors of medicine who have been in the gig 40 years. They've got, X, Y, and Z prizes and, everything. And, when it comes down to a really difficult patient, they're still liaising with their colleagues to, ascertain what different perspectives there might be, to run the numbers and the, cost benefit of doing X, Y versus Z. So I think as long as you're aware of the limits of your practice and that you're willing to say, I don't know that, but I've equipped myself with the tools that I can go out and find you the answer, or I can find someone who will have the answer. And then just to constantly be absorbing.
Bit of a learning sponge to kind of help yourself get over that imposter syndrome a little bit.
Yeah, no, but it's great. I mean, I think it's served me really well, because I mean, now I can do, like, our studios, like, a coding package, and even before that, I would do a lot of the clinical trials stats myself. As data comes in, I'll be like, I just want to see where's this going.
Inquisitive.
Real unhealthily sized Excel sheet cranking away, burning through your laptop. But then when you go to the statistician, you're like, oh, I did X, Y, and Z. I think this is where it's leaning, and I think these are the p-values. I think this is a confounding factor. They're like that impressed, and then you gain a higher level of exchange with them. And similarly with like data managers. So because we were relatively under resourced in the NHS compared to a commercial entity, the CRF design, I was doing bits of that. I was doing bits of data entry when I was in the NHS. So when I talk to data managers, I'm like, don't put it like that, because some idiot like me will come along, put in the wrong answer, and a generate query, and then we'll have clean data. So I think learning as much as possible in a broad sense is very, very useful. And then that helps you kind of overcome problems that arise in the future, but also when you have got one of those questions you just don't know the answer to, and you seek out someone in a field that does or should have the answer, enough about that field to be able to quantify the problem in a way that will get you the answer more quickly. But I still think having imposter syndrome is important in all walks of life, not just professionally, personally.
You have to kind of be humble, and I think in any business, if it's professional, personal, clinical development, whatever it might be, kind of being a good person is gets you a long way. Something I've learned anyway from prior experiences. If you kind of look after people, you tend to do pretty well. Being a good person is definitely a number one trait of being a good leader, good business owner, whatever you want to put it.
Yeah, I think, especially in clinical trials, there is ultimately, especially in early phase clinical trials, there will be problems you face that there are no answers for. And that's the reason why you're conducting this research. For early phase at least, but in later phases as well, and even in post-market studies, you have to be comfortable with the degree of uncertainty. There will be answers that don't yet exist. So you have to be able to sit with that and then go back to your basic principles, go back to all the things you try to delete from your brain in medical school, like pathophysiology and all basic PKD, and work from those principles up, because the answers don't exist. So you have to be able to at least narrow down where the answer might lie, even if no one knows what the answer is. Imposter syndrome, I'm a big fan, big proponent for imposter syndrome, at least temporarily, and as long as it doesn't become a detriment to your work-life balance. But there's that kind of, I can't forgotten the name of it in psychology, but it's like the graph of anxiety versus performance, and you want to be somewhere, it's kind of a bell-shaped curve. You want to be somewhere in the middle. You don't want to be so chill that you're not performing, you don't care. You don't want to be so anxious that you can't function. So you want to be somewhere in between in that performance. I think imposter syndrome lies in that same kind of distribution. You want to be certain in the things that you're certain about, but always kind of baking in, at least a thread of self-doubt, so that you're always kind of fact-checking yourself and you're not becoming complacent in what you're doing. Because ultimately, it's the patients or the compound itself that can, you could have the best drug in the world, and if you run the trial really poorly, it will never see the light of day. So there's lots of things to keep you up at night.
I've seen that graph actually, and I think a lot of it also comes down to staying motivated, and when you kind of progress your career, sometimes, not all the time, motivation can drop, or motivation can kind of dip in and out. But like you say, to get a drug approved, and for it to have a positive effect to the patient population it's trying to target, you need a doctor that's going to stay motivated the whole time. So what motivates you? Because you've obviously, like I've already mentioned already, great academic career. You've now gone on to industry, done 5 years there. All going really well so far. So has there ever been a person that motivates you? Is there ever been a moment in your life that keeps you motivated, or is it just your desire for something else?
I think always keeping, I guess, I've always just done what was interesting. So I've never, like ophthalmology, I really wanted to like ophthalmology, but I just wasn't interested in ophthalmology. And then I just wrote that off. So I was like, I'm going to do that. And then I just said yes to projects that came my way based on interest I had. And if I had an interest, didn't have any experience in it, I would I'd reach out and try and shoehorn some experience in it. And if I liked it, I'd pursue that to the next step and the next step and the next step. So there's kind of to approach things iteratively, I think is the best way to kind of flesh that out.
Sounds like that you mentioned there, almost like a desire to learn.
I'd like to think so. And as a physician, you'd have something.
You better anyway. Yeah.
Right. Well, I learned in medical school is all I'm learning. That's it.
That might not be what like intrinsically motivates you, because people are motivated by loads of different things. It could be, like you say, a person, an event that's happened. It could even be materialistic things, or might not be. Everyone's different. So, but what you were saying then about the ophthalmology thing, it was like, all ophthalmologists listening, ophthalmology is great. I'm not gonna bash ophthalmology, but
hi guys, it's a great career. If you like it, yes. One of my very good friends is an ophthalmologist in Glasgow, so she's listening. Kiva, I think you're doing great work. No, but I think in terms of like events, I guess that crystallized it. I guess the thing that when you get really bogged down in your 100th email of the day, or you're signing off contract number 9 and blah blah blah, I think the thing you can get very lost in the weeds of what you're doing, and it's always important to kind of like zoom out macroscopically, think about what you're doing, what's the point of this. So like in like screenwriting for like films and TV, they always have like an A plot and smaller B plots. So the B plots are like the love story between Princess Leia and Han. It's not critical. It's not critical to the plot, but it's there. And then the A plot is obviously defeat the Emperor. He's bad. So I think sometimes you get lost in the B plot. So you have to think about the A plot. And what did that for me was when I was in my bachelor's degree. So I was in like this 12th month of this research placement. And I've been looking in the microscope. I've been looking at like 400 plus samples from patients, and it just became so tedious. And you're literally going along like putting dots on things and scoring things. So also very depressingly, AI could do that now in about 35 minutes. But that was bachelor's at the time, but I was just completely lost in the weeds. And then anyway, it transpired. We discovered something new about glioblastoma, so this brain cancer. So he discovered like a new mechanism of how it was spreading along nerves, basically. And then, for a brief period of time, this postdoc, and our supervisor, this really passionate Greek woman, had like 2 very apathetic Irish people. So after this like really laborious, really boring process of, looking at all these slides, we saw this thing that's happening. It was repeatedly happening. The Dr. Georgia Mavaria, University of Leeds, I think she's still there, was like, the three of us in this room are the only people in the world that knows that this is a thing that's happening. And I was like, oh wow, that's really cool. So I think that was probably the moment I was like, overcome the minutia, or at least it gave a sense of gratitude to the many, many hours as an already pale man being in a very dark room in St. James Hospital in Leeds. That one drop of vitamin D was had for about 6 months. Even before I was a patient, anytime I walked through the hall.
Oh, that's funny. You'd have to take your factor 50 if you'd go out into the sun, though. Anyway, you'd be burning.
I mean, factor 50 all day, every day. That's why I still look like this, Jamie. I got ID thing on
That's not the Botox, is it? Surely
not yet. Not yet. Not ruling anything out.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so in terms of kind of moving forward, looking forward, you're executive director now. Sounds like going really well at Infinito's. What would you say the end goal is for you?
As best as I can envision. So the difficulty is, at the minute, there aren't huge numbers of role models who have done a bit of industry, bit of clinical, bit of academia. But I think those are beginning to emerge. So there's a guy, Professor Daniel Marks at UCH, who's been very kind to give me some of his time. And I spoke to him, and he's kind of been able to balance those three things to a certain degree. So I think, if all goes well, continue along this kind of, as best I can, continue on the classical pathway of physician scientist. So, I've done my master's now, be thinking about PhDs in a couple of years, but alongside, doing some industry and doing some clinical at the same time. So,
you're not busy now, you're going to be double busy.
Well, compared to A&E nights, it's a downside better than that. But I think, maintaining those three things and, trying to facilitate becoming as good as I can in each of them, without compromising one of the other, or just like go live on a beach, just drop off the map. So I think so. Obviously, imminently will be to complete training in pharmaceutical medicine. So I got my last kind of set of exams coming up for that, which should be really good.
Good luck.
Begin looking at PhDs, I think.
Yeah.
Along, hopefully something that's going to be integrated with what I'm doing professionally.
My last question would be is kind of, we spoke a lot about early stage in your career and kind of early stage doctors that are looking to get into the industry. So we could do a whole other hour talking about your career post that. But my final question is kind of, what advice would you give an early stage doctor who wants to get into the industry? What would be your biggest bit of advice to give them?
I think know what you want, research it, and then find someone who's doing it or has had a similar career path to you, and begin to explore those options of what those look like. So obviously, I'm very much, preaching from the gospel of oncology, clinical development. So take everything I say with a pinch of salt. But I think regardless of what you want to go into, if you're going to be involved in clinical trials in any capacity, I think you need to have clinical experience in clinical trials. That doesn't have to be in the specialty you're interested in. That doesn't have to be in an academic form. That could be with, as a screening physician for various CROs that exist in the UK and abroad. But to begin to learn the vernacular and the colloquialisms used within clinical trials are not something you will have come across likely in your clinical practice. And one of your kind of sole benefit being a physician is kind of trying to see where all the dots connect, whether that's in medical affairs, clinical development, or whatever. So I think research what element you're interested in, find someone who's doing it, and try to get some experience yourself before trying to commit to it. I could recommend the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Medicine's website from the Royal College of Physicians. They've got nice little breakdowns and PDFs on what the role of a pharmaceutical physician is, what that looks like, different branches of it. But it is really great, flexible career paths. You can do no clinical if you want, or you can do lots of clinical. You can do basic science, you can do translational science. So I think that's the biggest piece of advice is if you want to move to industry, what part of the industry and why, and try desperately to gain some experience because like anything, you don't know if you like it until you do it.
Great advice, and thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to me today and being our first guest. So
Jamie, it's an honor.
I was going to say you should feel
nice and low for everyone else comes after me.
that was it. I thought if I could get someone in, it can only get better, right?
Yeah, like oh god.
Always a pleasure, never a chore with you. So yeah, thank you so much. And anyone who's listening has got any questions, I'm sure you'll be happy to answer them on LinkedIn and in the comments, or myself as well. We're happy to answer anything or go into any further detail if we didn't cover enough.
Happy to be contacted. You can get me through LinkedIn. I'm usually relatively responsive. I mean, at the minute with jet lag, I've been responding at 3 a.m. So let me know.
Thanks again. You owe me dinner or lunch even from our last.
You're breaking up, Jamie. You're breaking up.
Yeah. Anyway, all the best. Take care, and speak to you soon. Maybe round 2 on the podcast for a second outing, or who knows.